mean, they're cryptic species. They're hard to capture. They're rare to see, except if you're out at night, right? So there's just a lot of open areas of inquiry for these cute little critters.
Welcome back to the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast, where we share the stories and science of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'm your host, Emmy Reed, and I'm so thrilled you're joining us today for a fascinating dive into Greater Yellowstone's bats. Bats elicit many emotions from us: fear, intrigue, aversion, adoration. These pint-sized flyers often go unnoticed, yet they play a vital role in maintaining the balance of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. From their incredibly unique adaptations to their contributions to pest control, bats are truly nature's unsung heroes. We're joined by Dr. Riley Bernard, an applied wildlife ecologist and assistant professor in the Department of Zoology and Physiology at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Bernard's research focuses on the ecology and behavior of cryptic species, including bats, on topics such as foraging, competition, invasive species interactions, the effects of disease on community structure, species susceptibility, and survival. When it comes to Greater Yellowstone bat ecology, she's definitely an expert. We chatted for quite a long time, so we've split the conversation into 2 episodes. This episode, Part 1, will explore what bat species are found in Greater Yellowstone, how their flying abilities stack up next to birds, their use of echolocation and how their prey adapts to combat it, and how bats are literally mini supermoms. Also, prepare to be surprised by how fast some bats can fly. All right, let's jump into this bat-tastic episode. Dr. Bernard, welcome to the podcast. We're so thrilled that you're able to join us today. I'm really excited for this extra spooky episode about bats. So to get us started, could you tell us why you decided to focus on the study of bats? Did you find bats or did bats find you?
Well, that's a great question. I've always said that bats found me. And I guess a little backstory is, I grew up in Western Oregon, about an hour south of Portland, in the foothills of the Cascades. And my parents have a log house. So very much in the woods, very, surrounded by nature and everything. And there were several instances growing up where, despite their best efforts, bats got in the house, right? I mean, it's a log house, so it happens. So there's been some times when bats got in the house, and I remember being absolutely fascinated by them, not scared, like most people tend to be when they see a wild critter in their room. I would say I'm more unnerved by mice being in my room than I was bats. But so that was growing up. And then fast forward to my undergrad at Linfield University. And the very first week of school, my roommate and I, she woke me up saying that there was a bat in our room. And we were in a corner dorm, and one window had a screen, the other did not. So this bat had found its way into our dorm room. And I just remember Tommy was her name. She was absolutely terrified by this bat in the room. And so here I am, like trying to navigate a blanket to get it to go out. And we both lunged for the window as soon as the bat went out. So they kind of kept tapping on me, and I didn't really think about it much until going to a study abroad on my senior year of college. And that was when I actually had the chance in Australia to capture bats. And we were doing it according to all the permits and regulations for Australia for the School for Field Studies. And this one female bat we captured in a harp trap at dawn, and she was pregnant, so we didn't want to release her and have her potentially get predated upon. So we kept her in a shoebox all day. And when we went to release her that night, she had twins, which is pretty rare for most smaller bats, but she had twins. And one pup clung on to her and she flew away. The other pup was abandoned, so it must have been too weak. So I had to babysit this bat underneath my shirt and take it to a bat hospital, which they have loads of in Queensland because of all the flying foxes. And that bat did not survive, but it kind of just opened up my world to wondering, like, what is so cool about these bats? What's so cool about these creatures in general? And then I started thinking about, like, oh yeah, I've been kind of encountering them all my life. Like maybe this is an area of inquiry. And so that's kind of how I got started, actually. They found me and just, I wasn't listening until I was a little bit older, I guess.
Oh, they like that little guy that was under your shirt, he just latched on and then just didn't
Hmm.
let go, metaphorically. I think
Exactly.
I'm gonna follow you around and you're gonna study me. Oh.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, and it was kinda, I was in my senior year, so I was really starting to get into, like, learning how to look at the peer-reviewed literature and trying to investigate, like, how do scientists do science, and that's when I found that there was a lot of questions more so than answers in many respects for bats. I mean, they're cryptic species, they're hard to capture, they're rare to see, except if you're out at night, right? So there's just a lot of open areas of inquiry for these cute little critters that fly in the night sky.
With the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, which is the ecosystem that our podcast focus on, how many bat species do we have in this ecosystem?
Yeah, there's like the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, thinking about, like the Bighorn canyon region over to the Tetons and Yellowstone, have about 13 species of bats. And that is, some are residents year round. So, like our myotis species and maybe our big browns, they tend to stay within the area. They might migrate, short migration to and from seasonal roosts. So, that would be like a maternity or a bachelor colony, and then their hibernation or overwintering sites. And then the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem area also has migratory species, so like hoary bats and silver-haired bats. And those species can fly very, very, very long distances. So our hoary bats are known to fly from anywhere from like Mexico all the way to Canada seasonally. So they're moving a lot. So I would say, there's 13 that we can find fairly regularly, or that could be found in the area. And then we have, probably like 6 to 8 that are considered residents. There's a couple cool anecdotal occurrences or accidental occurrences of some species. So if you look at the Wyoming Game and Fish Mammal Atlas, it kind of has when species have been identified in the region. And so there was an unpredictable occurrence of Brazilian free-tailed bat, as well as a big free-tailed bat. So they're not usually found that far north. And there's also this one occurrence, allegedly historically, of the northern long-eared bat, which is very suspect because they have never been found since then. But there's sometimes bats get off track, like they are flying, and so different storms or weather patterns could knock them a little bit farther west or east than they're used to going. But yeah, classically about 13 species.
Fascinating. With those species, do you see competition?
Well, that's a good question. As far as territoriality, I don't know that that's necessarily been documented, at least in our species up here. However, our species are all insectivorous, so they're all eating insects in the GYE. And the fascinating thing about bats is that they are adapted to multiple types of habitats, right? So you have some species like our hoary bats and our silver-haired bats that have wing structures that make them better at foraging in more open areas. So, like above the treetops or in broad corridors like roads or rivers. We also have some species that tend to be a bit smaller body size, like our myotis species, that are more what we consider clutter adapted. So they have a little bit kind of boxier wings, and they can fly in and out of cluttered environments like forests and riparian areas. So that themselves kind of allows for them to partition themselves out across a variety of ecosystem types. So some are going to be in close clutter, some are going to be in these open areas. With that comes differences in what they could eat. So you can imagine insects are also going to be a little bit different in a forested ecosystem versus being above trees or out in an open prairie system. So they do have some competition. However, I think that evolutionarily they're able to kind of disperse over this gradient of resources as well. But most bats, I would say, are generalist foragers. So we don't necessarily have any of our insectivorous bats that eat only this one specific type of insect. However, if you think about body size, which equates to mouth size, the bigger bats tend to eat bigger things like bigger moths and beetles. The smaller bats eat smaller things like flies and beetles and moths that are just a little bit easier to grasp.
Gotcha. Okay. Um, so bats are the world's only flying mammal. Can you tell us a little bit about the evolutionary history of bats gaining the power of flight?
Yeah, so the evolution of bats is still kind of an area of inquiry. Ultimately, there's a lot that we don't know about bats, past and present, to be honest with you. Um, what we do know in general that bats evolved about 65 to 50 million years ago during the Eocene. And what's one thing that makes it hard to know exactly or to pinpoint exactly how bats evolved is because they did not fossilize as easily as bigger animals. So bats, even when they were, our ancient ancestors, were still very small. Their bones are very thin. And so they also lived in forest habitats, which means it wasn't necessarily the best place to become a fossil if and when one died. So have a fossil, you kind of have to die in the right place at the right time and not get scavenged on. And so for our bats, that tends to be a little bit more challenging. One of the earliest known fossils that has been discovered was in Fossil Butte National Monument, so just south of the GYE. And it's estimated that this species, which is, I'm not going to even try to say the scientific name because I'm going to butcher it. It dates back to about 52 million years, and it had claws on all 5 of its fingers, which is definitely different than what our modern day bats have. And new technology has found that other fossils found in Germany suggest that bats were mostly brown. And then, based on the ear anatomy, our early bats did not echolocate either.
Oh,
So, yeah, so echolocation is a little bit more recent. And I know we'll get to that in a little bit too, but it's estimated that echolocation, not all bats echolocate, but that on the evolutionary tree, it likely evolved in 2 different time periods or 2 different times.
okay.
So we're still learning a lot about that too, and that's still more of a recent finding. Um, Thinking of flight, though, scientists are still trying to figure out when and how bats became capable of flight. All the fossils we do have seem to point towards them already having that ability. So we don't have necessarily that transitional form that highlights this is exactly when bats started flying. It's kind of the same as knowing how and when and why birds fly. Like what led these organisms to the treetops to then transition from a gliding species to maybe a flighted species. So some researchers suggest that our early bats were likely furry gliders. So and then they evolved to have this powered flight. But again, like because we have this gap in the fossil record, we're still trying to figure that part out. Um, some of the cool morphological elements of early bats suggest that their hind limbs or their legs were flexed to the side. And so they were more able to climb up things a little bit more efficiently than versus like trying to stand up on 2 legs. So that's why we probably see their body plan being a little bit more crawling versus standing. So if we transition to those flying abilities for our modern day bats, the reason why they are likely to hang upside down, for example, are because just like birds, they have to lighten the load, right? So for birds, we have hollow bones or pneumatic bones where there's this interstitial space that allows for air to be in there instead of more the bone marrow. So it lightens a bird. Our bats are mammals, so they do not have hollow bones, but they have thinner, longer bones. And so their legs are not capable of just having that compression of standing. So bats actually need to fall a little bit before they fly to get loft. And they are rubbish at trying to take off from the ground. So it takes them a lot to just take off.
Oh
So yeah, so
no.
they've evolved flight, but it's sometimes not the most pretty when they are not hanging upside down and take off.
Oh no. Because yeah, I was going to ask, where do they kind of rank in the hierarchy of flying abilities? Like, is there anything they can do that other flyers can't? But it sounds like takeoff is maybe it can be a little hard if they're on the ground, but is there anything like really interesting about their flight that could make them stand apart from certain birds or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, minus the fact that they can't take off from the ground, which, is probably the only thing that birds have on them. But I might be biased, of course.
Fair
Um,
enough.
yeah, but I mean, they're pretty phenomenal when it comes to flight. Like I said, there's long distance migrating species like hoary bats that are moving from like Canada to South Central America, so more along the continents. And so they technically likely migrate farther than any other land-based mammal. I know we have some really great migrations in the GYE, in the Red Desert, when we think about mule deer and pronghorn and things like that. But as far as mammal migration goes, bats might be some of the dominant ones as far as how far they can go. And that's attributed to the fact that they can fly. So they're able to get pretty far distances. So, for that, sure, there's probably some birds that definitely still migrate farther. So birds might still have bats on like the true distance, because some of those birds are going 10,000 miles in one migration. Bats haven't done that yet that I know of. Um, we have, like I told you before, like their wings are adapted for all different kinds of habitats, which is also true for birds. So you have birds that have longer, narrower wings that are those migrators, which is what our bats have. And then you have like chickadees that have little squattier wings, just like our bats do. They're more clutter adapted. One thing that I think is really cool is that my PhD advisor, Dr. Gary McCracken and colleagues had worked on a project to try to see how fast bats can fly. And so he had Brazilian free-tailed bats with little GPS trackers or VHF trackers, and they were tracking those bats using a motorcycle as well as a plane, and we're able to get the straight line distance flight speed for these bats, and it was over 100 miles per hour, which I say does knock birds down a bit, because the fastest bird is getting that speed by just tucking its wings and diving. So like when peregrine falcons dive, they're going really fast, but this is like a straight line, horizontal flight. So Brazilian free-tailed bats, or bats in general, might actually be faster at flying than birds are. So, and it's
Wow.
powered flight. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's so crazy. I just think of them as, like, sometimes just, like, little bean bags with, like, just
Yeah.
little wings, and I just don't like, I've seen them be, acrobatic in the air, diving around, but they're always, like, just flapping like crazy, but it's so cool to learn that they're actually pretty graceful, fast, super fast
Mm-hmm.
flyers. It's just something I would not have thought about them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other cool thing about bats is that they can actually carry a pretty decent sized payload. So, like, the word payload is associated with like drones and having something additional in the drones. And so you have like the certain percentage of weight that can be carried appropriately when you're trying to fly something. So, for bats, when females have babies, they can be anywhere from a third to almost 50% of their body mass of the female. So, like, that's like 100-pound woman having a 30 to 50-pound baby. And I know. And the wild thing is that because these babies are brand new and naked, they cling on to mom. And so then she flies around with them when she is foraging or transitioning between roost to roost. So she's carrying this 30 to 50% her body weight baby on her, for a period of time. And so that's something that most birds probably don't do either, as far as care. They can carry things like food, maybe, but this is like half the body weight of this animal is being carried and just like dead weight on the stomach, basically.
Right,
So,
it's just
yeah.
oh my gosh, do they, has there been any data on does carrying the baby affect their hunting abilities, or they're just so adapted and ready for it that it doesn't seem to really affect their success rates?
I'm sure it does. I'm sure having that weight, like either being pregnant, probably slows the females down a bit, just because, just like it does a human female, right? You're not running a marathon. At least most people aren't running a marathon. Um, for bats, I bet it does, because you have this thing that's hanging on to you and you're not able to actually fly as far. I don't know that necessarily anyone's tested that, or at least I have not come across that information. However, when we are doing research on the bats, and we're putting on a transmitter or a GPS tag or anything like that, we try to stick to about 5 to 10% of the body weight. Like we don't want to add anything beyond that so that we're not causing or impeding flight ability or foraging ability or things like that. So, you
Gotcha.
know, it's a little bit different than, hiking with a big backpack where you're on solid ground. Like they still need to be able to be efficient flyers. So at least what as scientists we try to minimize that burden for sure. But babies don't care. they
Right. And it's
they
like, "Hey, bats are still here, so obviously it's working and she's getting enough food to take care of the."
mhm.
How are they holding on? Are they, like, kinda just hooked in on her fur, or do they ever fall off?
They can. Yeah, yeah, I think if the baby doesn't have a good hold, they can fall off. Most times, they're pretty good at hanging on. They will use their claws on their feet, and they have their wings are their hands. It's like, as opposed to a bird where it's like the whole arm piece is like the wing. But so they have little thumbs with little nails on their thumbs, and so that too is another place that they can cling on. And the females will carry them around for probably a couple days to maybe a week or so until they have enough fur to kind of hang out on their own and be safe. And or if there's a larger colony, they might like kind of drop them off at daycare a little bit earlier. But for the most part, when the babies get too big, that's when the female probably starts weaning them off the caring element. And then within about 4 to 6 weeks, those babies should be able to start flying with mom to go capture insects.
Gotcha. Wow. Must be a wild ride being a freshly born baby bat,
Yeah.
like, just stuck
Uh-huh.
to mom, and it's like, "Okay, now let's do some barrel rolls," and you're
Mhm.
gonna get, trial by fire with what it's like to be a bat.
Exactly. Yeah. Mhm.
Um, so one of the incredible things about bats is their echolocation. Can you tell us a bit about what echolocation is and how bats use it, or at least the ones that have it? Because you mentioned earlier that not all bats use echolocation.
Yeah, so echolocation is basically this sensory system that's made by sound. So bats emit high frequency sounds that are well beyond our hearing ability. So our bats in the GYE tend to echolocate around, like probably 18 kilohertz as the lowest, all the way up to 50 kilohertz. And so this is quite a broad range, but all different species kind of align up within that range itself. Some species, like our open air flyers, tend to be a little bit lower frequency. Our bigger bodied bats also tend to have lower frequency. And then our myotis species tend to be those that are smaller bodied and then have higher frequency calls. So the echolocation themselves is a useful way to see and navigate in their environment and find food. So bats are not blind, right? That's a myth that we all have been told or assume is real. They're not blind, but echolocation helps them see. So it's like turning on your high beams when you're driving through the forest, right? Like you can see a little bit better than just the regular beams. So it's opening up that viewpoint. And so a lot of bats that are navigating will kind of alter their amount or their pulse rate of their echolocation. So how often they're emitting noise and listening for those echoes. So in those clutter adapted species, again, those that are in a forested ecosystem are going to be echolocating more often. So they're trying to navigate through those trees than say ones that are the open air foragers or open air flyers like our Brazilian free-tail bats and hoary bats, where they just kind of echolocate every once in a while. Yep, still empty, silence, okay, keep going, unless they're foraging. And then they're going to be echolocating a lot more because they're trying to find that food. One of the really fascinating things is that these high frequency calls are incredibly loud. And so when a bat emits this noise, it can temporarily deafen itself so that it does not blast its own ears out. And so it'll kind of not necessarily unhinge its ear bones, but it will loosen those middle ear bones a bit through a tendon, and then it will blast that noise out, get those ears back ready to go, and listen for the echoes. And the wild thing is that, of course, for predator prey relationships, right, the predators want to eat the prey do not want to get eaten. So there's this evolutionary arms race that's occurring between a lot of bat prey and the bats themselves. So there are several species of moths that can hear echolocation. And so they can either avoid those bats because they can hear the bat screaming into the void saying, "Where is my food?" Um, so they can avoid, juke away. There's other species that can actually jam bat echolocation. So it'll send out its own pulse and just kind of confuse the bat so they can't quite see where it's at. And then there's others that have adapted almost like a soundproofing on their scales, and the sound will just be absorbed into their scales and no echo will return. So it's kind of cool to see how the bats eventually adapt to that and how the prey adapts to that as well. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic out there.
How do bats so I feel like oftentimes I've seen bats like hunting out in a little group together. How do they not get their echolocation mixed up? Is it that they know their own very specific sound and um are able to just hone in on that, or do they like, "Oh my gosh, is this mine? Is this my buddy's?" Like how do they
Hmm.
not not even like run into each other, but how does it they just not get confused, I guess?
Yeah, they have ways to make sure that they don't confuse themselves with other sounds. So, we say in general that these bats, so like if I'm talking about a little brown bat, they tend to be a 40 kilohertz bat. And so that's where if you were to visualize what echolocation looks like for a little brown, they have kind of like little backwards hockey sticks where it's like these little tiny J's, and it goes from like a high frequency to a low frequency. So that 40 kilohertz is kind of that bottom frequency. And so that's what we as scientists try to use to classify bats and then also look at characteristic shapes of those calls. So, what bats can do is that they can modulate their frequencies. So, if they're in a cluster of lots of other bats, so if we say look at Brazilian free-tailed bats in Congress Avenue Bridge, right? They're all coming out together. There's millions of individuals. There's probably some nuance between individual recognition, just like I recognize my voice is a little bit different than my sister's voice, but they sound similar. Um, but if I'm out foraging, if I'm a bat, I can increase my frequency or decrease my frequency a tad and know to listen for that change if I'm in this big cluster. There's always also ways that bats can change how they echolocate. So sometimes those open foragers, they're called like constant frequency. So they kind of stick around the same frequency for each pulse. If they get into a cluttered environment, then they can become or change their frequency to modulating it. So it's like frequency modulate. So they can also change that as well based off of their environment. So they're pretty well attuned to hearing their own, adapting as necessary, and then moving along. There are times when they absolutely crash into each other. Like if you
Oh
were to watch a
no.
slow motion video of emergences at these bigger colonies, like our Brazilian free-tailed bats, they are totally running into each other. So despite their best efforts, they're still as clumsy as we are.
Understandable. Hey, it's gonna happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh. Um, what are the most popular species found in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem? Or like, sorry, not popular, most prolific, the larger makeup of the Greater Yellowstone bats.
Yeah, so I actually have a nice little report here that helps me know exactly how many of these species were captured in the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem
Oh,
area. So I can
cool.
actually tell you right off the bat, pun intended. So for the most part, I would say that species like our little brown bats, so Myotis leucificus, those are one of the most common, and they're found throughout Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, that whole area. Um, we also have species like our silver-haired bat and our hoary bats that are captured quite frequently. There's some evidence of other species of Myotis that are captured with some regularity, so like the long-legged bat or Myotis volans. And then within there, like, at least during a couple of these reports that I was looking at to kind of see in general, other species kind of fill in, less than 10 or around that, for each of these areas that the census occurred. But little brown bats are very, very common, or those that if you happen to, encounter a bat at a bridge or in your house or see, something like that, they tend to be little browns or big brown bats for the most part, which we're not very creative when it comes to naming things, obviously.
I I think it's sweet. It's like it just makes them sound so cute and just like little a fuzzy ball of fur
They
hurtling through
are.
the air. Yeah.
They absolutely are.
What's a very, like, unique species that you could find in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem? Like, if it pops up on a census or if you capture one when you're doing your field work where you're like, "Holy crap, like, that's awesome to see
Hmm.
this bat."
Yeah. Oh, the spotted bat. This is my, this, I don't even know, Shangri-La bat, one that I want to capture at some
Okay.
point. I mean, I encourage any listener to look up this bat because the spotted bat is one of the coolest looking bats in probably our temperate North America. So that's like US and Canada. It's a black colored bat with white spots on it. So almost like a cow, I mean, that's the best way to describe it. And then it has these massive pink ears, and it is incredibly rare to capture. I don't even know. I mean, a spotted bat was captured, 20 of them, during this, early 2000s census in the Bighorn Canyon area. So they are fairly elusive. They're actually one that we as humans can hear because they echolocate at such low frequencies. But they're one that I have yet to capture and I really want to. But if that was one that was picked up on a census, a lot of local bat biologists and those afar would be very envious because we all share our pictures and everything on social media. And as soon as someone gets a spotted bat, we're all like, no, I want to capture one
I'm
of those.
definitely next.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is that your favorite bat species found in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's because I've just always, like, once I started getting into bats, seeing that one has always been such a dream of mine. I think, ultimately, favorite bat that I have captured is probably the Hawaiian hoary bat because that was the first one I did my graduate research on, and so it's its own, just one species out in Hawaii, and so it's very easy to identify. But they're sassy, they are loud, and they're just lovely.
Love that. When it comes to the different species and echolocation, because I think of like the little brown bats, I feel they're like so compact and they have little ears. And then
Hmm.
you think of like the Townsend's bat that seems like he's mostly all ears. Does like ear size affect echolocation at all?
Yeah, absolutely does. Ear size and even the configuration or morphology of their nose will also affect echolocation. So to the ear point, our bats that use echolocation day in, day out to navigate and to find their prey are those smaller bats that have the smaller or more reasonably sized ears. We still have, I mean, there's still within the small eared bats, we still have long eared bats, which are, still small compared to our Townsends or our pallid
Mhm.
bats or spotted bats. But those bats echolocate and are listening for those pulses to come back. The big eared bats that, like our Coronarhinus species, or like I said, the pallid bats and the spotted bats, at least in our neck of the woods, they are also considered whispering bats. And so they can listen for the movement of insects on leaves, in leaf litter, on the ground, and they can, because of those big ears, know exactly where it is and be able to grab it without having to echolocate. So it kind of minimizes that evolutionary arms race where they're trying, like a tit for tat of the predator prey. And so, like our pallid bats, they will eat scorpions on the ground. So
Wow.
they're actually immune to the scorpion stings, and they do echolocate, but they probably don't echolocate to find scorpions necessarily. So they're probably listening because they have big honkery ears. Um, Thinking about facial morphology, so most of our bats have that we find here in the GYE are they're going to be echolocating from their mouth. So they're just screaming out these echolocation calls and listening, waiting for the echoes to come back. There are some species like horseshoe bats or bats that have big nose leafs. So you see nose leafs in South Central America, Southeast Asia, things like that. They can actually echolocate from their nose, And then the way the sound comes back, it hits that nose leaf or that nose ornamentation and then goes into their ears. So it kind of helps direct the sound a little bit differently. So we have vocal and nasal echolocation, and they're all used to kind of help navigate and forage.
Oh, that's fascinating. Are there any unique interactions between bats and other wildlife species found in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem?
Yeah, I would say that, the bats are having them around in the GYE helps minimize pests, right? So mosquitoes, biting flies, biting insects that cause disease. Those by having bats there, they're either directly consuming those insects or they are scaring those insects away. So the landscape of fear is something that we find where maybe bats don't eat all the mosquitoes, but having a bat around can scare a bunch of mosquitoes away, as an example. So there's that pest deterrence. There's also, in preparation for this question, I was digging something up and I found that in an area called Cedar Creek, there were several months of game camera footage that had a deer walk through and bats flying around the deer. And so these folks at Cedar Creek were hypothesizing that these bats were eating the biting flies that were bothering the deer. So that's pretty cool. I've never seen that before until kind of prepping for this question as far as like what are these different interactions. But yeah, it was a long period of time that in multiple documents or findings of this. And so it wasn't just like a one-off. I would say, outside of wildlife, again, having bats in the GYE help minimize pests of trees and vegetation and things like that. So having them around is going to be very useful for just basic healthy ecosystem function.
Mhm. Are there any other ways that bats play an ecological role in the GYE?
Yeah, I mean, our bats as insectivores help keep insect populations in check. So that's one. We don't have any true pollinators, like, say, further south. So bats can act as pollinators, they act as seed dispersers, they act as pest deterrents. They also can maybe minimize diseased animals through, the vampire bats as an example could potentially drain a chicken like sometime, and I'll get into vampire bats, I'm sure, um but yeah, like I think for the GYE they're primarily going to be insect eaters, so that means minimizing pests, whatever a pest may be that flies. So human pests, animal pests, crop pests, forest pests, so they're really helping out that way. And yeah, I think just, even though they might not be on purpose pollinators, they might move some pollen around too, just by where they are roosting or flying by. So, but I would say those insectivores are going to be very useful for keeping pest populations at a minimum.
I see. So, if for some reason the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem lost a large portion of its bat population, is it accurate to say that there we would see an increase in pests and maybe is there anything else that comes to mind when you could imagine an ecosystem without bats?
Oh, terrifying. That's the, I
Right.
mean, so we have already lost 6 million bats in North America. So temperate North America, again, Canada and the US, due to a disease called white nose syndrome. So, white nose syndrome is a disease of hibernating bats, and it's caused by a cold loving fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans. And this fungus is a poor competitor in caves and mines, but when bats are present, it just eats them up, literally. So, what happens is that bats that utilize torpor or hibernation, right? They, much like our bear, they will fatten up in the fall and then they have enough fat to survive throughout the entire winter period, which in our neck of the woods could last, almost 9 months, depending on the winter, right? So these bats, a healthy bat has kind of perfectly timed arousal periods. So when we say a bat is in torpor, they're actually not sleeping. They're probably at a sleep deficit, really. So they don't wake up in the true sense of bears kind of coming out and waking up out of hibernation. These bats will come out of torpor, which is where their body temperature is low, their metabolism is low, their heart rate is low, immune function suppressed. And so every 2 weeks or so, a healthy bat will arouse out of torpor, so get back up to normal body temperature, go to the bathroom, maybe grab a snack that's in the cave, and then engage back in that torpor again. So they have this kind of perfectly planned evolutionarily. White nose syndrome comes in, and it takes advantage of these bats during this energetically exhaustive time period, hibernation. So as bats are in torpor for 2 weeks at a time, the fungus starts infiltrating that mammalian tissue, so anything like their wings, their nose, their ears, and starts really disrupting the normal physiological processes. So bats don't just use their wings for flight. They also are used for blood pressure regulation. They can kind of breathe through their wings a bit too because of how vascular it is. So as these bats start succumbing to infection from PD or that fungus, they start arousing more frequently. And so they start burning through those fat stores a lot faster, and then they start trying to do something. So just like our dogs and cats might exhibit sickness behavior, our bats might move to a different part of the cave that they think might be better for them, to maybe kill off this fungus, but it might be too exposed or too cold, and so they freeze to death. Or they leave the cave altogether to try to forage, and that's going to be probably not very successful in the GYE. Where I did my PhD in Tennessee, there are insects that are still out, so bats are able to kind of forage and resupply food as necessary. But this fungus is really devastating our bat population. So we have 3 species of bats now that are either listed as endangered, so the northern long-eared bat, or petitioned for listing because of white nose syndrome. So that's our little brown bat, the one that I told you is everywhere in Wyoming and the GYE, as well as the tricolored bat, which we do have in the eastern portions of the state, in Wyoming and Montana. So it is highly possible that we might experience a big decline in our bat population in the GYE in the very near future. We have found the causative agent, so that fungus, throughout Wyoming. It's in Montana. It's also in Minnetonka Cave in Idaho. So we're kind of getting surrounded, and we're already starting to see some mass declines in our capture rates. And when we go out and try to listen for bats, we're not seeing or hearing as many as we used to of some species. Not all species are dying at the same rate. Some species, like many of our myotis species, so our little browns, our fringed, our long-eared, they are getting hit pretty hard. Our western small-footed bat seems to be doing okay for now. And then our migratory species and our bigger bodied bats, like our Townsend's bigger bat and our big brown, seem to be doing okay. But it's not a pretty picture when we're seeing it. We're trying to get ahead and get as much information as possible, but we are already seeing what a life without bats is like. And we see that more pesticides are being put on ag lands because the lack of bats there. So a recent study came out in Science magazine that was trying to link increases in human infant mortality to the increase in pesticide use attributed to the decline in bats since white nose syndrome was first documented in the US in 2006.
To continue this episode and learn more about the threats bats face today, the best places in the ecosystem to spot bat smashing bugs, and how you can be an advocate for bats, join us for part 2, available on November 1st, 2024. The Voices of Greater Yellowstone is a podcast by the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, a conservation nonprofit that works with all people to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. If you want to support the podcast, we'd love for you to share this episode with your social circles and help spread the stories and science of this remarkable ecosystem. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you over in part 2.